Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Islam in Life with me, Raza Ghazim. Why is the teenage phase so challenging? What are some of the key issues facing parents of teenagers? What guidelines can be given to help steer teenagers towards being practicing Muslims?
The teenage years have historically been a difficult period for parents in the West, with very few exceptions. Struggling to find their own place in the world, teenagers often rebel against the ways of their parents. Muslim children can also be tempted to drink alcohol or take drugs, be physically attracted to someone of the opposite sex in their class, skip school, or get involved in the wrong crowd. According to a survey entitled Alcohol Use by Muslim College Students in the United States, carried out by the Institute for Social Policy Understanding, 47% college-going young Muslims in the USA drink alcohol. 16% Muslim youth binge drink according to Muslim Americans, a National Portrait Gallup poll. Our great dreams for our children could suddenly turn into nightmares. This is, of course, a very frightening thought for most parents. What guidelines can be given to parents of teenagers to help them steer their children through this challenging and confusing phase of life and ensure that they come out of it as strong, practicing Muslims?
We're honored to be joined by our esteemed guest, Professor Tariq Ramadan, to discuss all of these issues. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. I wanted to ask you, is there any particular guidance about, teenagers as opposed to, let's say, just children from the Islamic perspective, from the Quran, that says, okay, teenagers should be dealt with in a particularly different way?
No, not in that way, not directly. But we can understand, for example, in Surah Luqman, that when Luqman, understood as a wise man, talking to his son is a teenager. You can understand from what is said and how things are structured that he's dealing with a young man reaching the age of reason, and he's telling him things about the way he has to be with God, the way he has to be even with his parents. And it's quite interesting because we are talking about the age of rebellion against authority or against the parents, and what you have in the Quran is something which is in between, understanding وَإِن جَاهَدَكَ عَلَى أَن تُشْرِكَ بِمَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا. If they are asking you and they are commanding and ordering you to do something which is against what is right, don't obey them. So meaning here that you have to be critical with there is a constructive critical attitude. Respect towards your parents doesn't mean to support them even if they are wrong, which is a very important way of dealing with the teenager situation, which is you have to respect when it's right and you have to be critical when it's wrong, even with your parents, meaning here that it's something that is going to be useful, and especially at the age of reason. And then you have the rest of the verse, وَصَاحِبْهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا. So you have to go along with them in the best way in this world. So there are things that we can get. And if you look after this on the prophetic traditions, there are lots of prophetic traditions dealing with companions who were young teenagers, and that you can get some teachings out of this.
And in this discourse that you talk about from within the Quran, can you see any parallels with today that you can see, okay, this is the same thing that needs to happen apart from the way that you're dealing with the parents? Is there anything else? You mentioned, as it was mentioned earlier, about the age of rebellion and the issues to do with that. Is there anything there?
What we can get out of this is very much about the spiritual attitude, which is, for example, once again, the way you have to be with your parents, the way you have, for example, to be with your practice or performing prayers, and what is the meaning of this? The sense of humility. لا تمشي في الأرض مرحا. So you have to show a kind of... So you have ethical teachings, but of course you don't have what we are talking about, which is what we call the teenager's crisis, which is a crisis when you go from childhood to adulthood, and in this in between. And the point here is the critical time of the age of reason. And the age of reason, what we have in the Quran is how do you understand your duties towards yourself and towards the community, and how do you have to be with human being, how do you have to understand the relationship that you have to God, towards God. So the age of reason is the age of taklif in Islam, is that when you start being responsible. So there is something here which is, how do you talk about faith to reason, or to the age of reason? And then now what we have to do is, how do you deal with this crisis? How do you deal with this very specific period of time? And this is why Muslims today, we need to get a better understanding of the individual evolution, the culture, because anything in your personality has to do with things that are within you and things that are in the relationship, the interaction you have with the environment, and then also what are the realities of the society within which you live, when it comes to the school environment, when it comes to what we are talking about now, the connection with, for example, social networks, drugs, alcohol. All this has to be taken into account. So we can't go in this discussion without having a deep understanding of the environment within which we live.
And within that kind of context of actually saying that we live in the West, and the clip talked about that perhaps the situation of teenagers in the Western context is somehow different, and the process that they are going through is going to be somewhat different. Is that the case, or are we, making it a bigger burden than it actually is?
In a way it is, but we have also to be cautious about this kind of understanding of the world. Is as if the global south, or our capitals in southern countries, are not westernized in a way. That's not true. The West is everywhere. Now if you are talking about countrysides, even in the West you have some areas where the people are living in a very traditional way in the West. So we have to be cautious with this. But the world culture is everywhere. So we are all facing the same challenges. We are all facing the same challenges. Now, when it comes to being, for example, in Western countries, living in the United States of America, in the big cities, if you are in New York, if you are in London, if you are wherever you are, you have to deal with the accessibility of some of the things that in moral terms are problematic. But not only this, you are in school systems where what is promoted is the individuals, the critical thinking, and autonomy, which per se are good things. Now, what we need to understand is that if we want the right education for our teenagers, is to stop talking to them if they were still children. That's the problem. In the way we are promoting culture, look at the great majority of the Islamic anashid, the Islamic song. These are for very young children, and we give this to our teenager, and the teenager are attracted by something which is the professional production of entertainment. So you have to deal with this, and when it comes to teenager, it's not only, you don't only talk to my reason. You have to talk to my heart. You have to talk to my body, because this is where my body is transforming. This is where my heart is opening toward things that are completely different. This is where my instincts are talking to me in a different way. Are you going to neglect that in the name of a very superficial religious teaching? It's not going to work that way. We have to elaborate much more on that.
And that's a very personal development in many senses. And whose responsibility is to deal with that sensitivity and that kind of personal development in a way that we're sensitive to the needs of the individual? Is it just the parents, or does it go beyond the parents? And how do you navigate that?
I think it's a good question. In the West, for example, it's quite clear that today our religious concerns are not shared by the school system. If you are in a state school system, that's not the point for them. It's just what they are doing is transmitting knowledge and do what they can to get this done. We are not talking about this. We want this to be done, but we have an ethical concern and moral concern, and we are talking about education. In Arabic, for example, we are differentiating between education and training and the ta'lim, التربية والتعليم. Education has to do with the behavior that we are teaching and trying to shape an understanding of the right behavior, the moral behavior. So it has to do with knowledge, it has to do with understanding, and it has to do with behaving. These things are going to be done, of course, start within the family, but it's also done within our institutions. We need now, for example, institutions run by people who are professionals on this and who are able to do what? What is needed if we are talking to teenagers? The first is, there is something in us, which is we are torn between attracted towards the good, attracted towards the bad, and this is us. I should be able to understand that it's natural. That's me. I'm like this. This is وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا. Allah is saying in the Quran, this is the way I created you. You have the two temptations. Now I need to get within my society a space where I can talk about this. The worst for the teenagers is to pretend. And what we are doing very often as Muslims is to push them to pretend. Don't talk and just show me that you are a good Muslim. So they get that. I'm going to show you that I can respect the rules, but I have another life. So we need much more communication. In the time of work culture where we are bombarded with all this, entertainment, feel free, do what you want, we need to get a sense of, okay, let us talk about what you feel and how you are going to deal with what you feel. So parents are instrumental, very important. And by the way, not only the mother, the father is important in the process.
Lots of interesting points, and we will pick up some of them. We do like to keep this show as interactive as possible and really value your opinion. Here is what you sent us this week.
This week we asked, what are the guidelines for parenting teenagers? Safia from USA said, once children near the teenage years, we have to develop a relationship with them based on friendship. They need to feel they can be understood by their parents before we can guide them. Sadiq from Kenya said, I think we need to train our children from a very young age to understand our values and culture. If they are groomed from childhood, chances of going astray are less. And Ahmed from Oman said, we need to give our teenagers the freedom to explore themselves, but within the boundaries of Islam. If we can find a formula to do this, then we will have won the battle.
Before concentrating on teenagers, I think it is a problem of parents. If parents can understand, what they want to transfer to their children and why, that's going to help them to do it. For example, I can point to the philosophy of ethics in Islam. If parents themselves are not clear about it, they cannot transfer it to the children.
I think it's more that we look to our parents, how they were before and how they had the sabr.
Parenting of teenagers, there is no right or wrong way of doing. But first of foremost, before I preach my children, I need to preach myself. I'm the prime example. So that's from my experience. And the first thing the child would look at, you are doing this, why am I not supposed to do it? So this is the best way. And then as I said before, there's no right way or wrong way. There's always going to be mistakes. Nobody's perfect. But I try as much as I can as a parent to act according to what I preach.
If you think your teenage is not behaving good, how do you approach them? How do you talk to them? Are you judgmental? Are you not? So I think that matters. The point of communication is very important in terms of teenage, because when I speak to teenagers myself and talk to them, about their experience, they say they don't understand us. So there's a gap there. There's a problem of communication. I would say problem of trust as well.
Parents' duty is not only giving love and affection to their children, but also making sure that they can feel it, because that feeling will be able to control them from doing bad things.
That's all the comments we have for this week. If you'd like to have your views featured in the show, be sure to follow us on Facebook or join us on Twitter. Now you can send your own videos with your comments and even your questions to islamandlife@presstv.com.
I want to link something that was said in the clip to what you said about ta'lim and tarbiyah, and said that in terms of tarbiyah, if you did that right from the beginning, then you wouldn't have some of those problems in the teenage years because you've been dealing with the child from the word go appropriately. So perhaps being not the absent father, but being present, so on, those kind of issues. How would you deal with that?
Of course, if you start the right way, there are, the probabilities that you are going to protect your daughter or your son from going astray. But you never know. You can't just be the good one and you have done what should have been done, and then at the end you don't know, because it's not only the relationship that you have with your son or your daughter.
Sorry to interrupt, but one of the things that comes to my mind, that even in the prophetic kind of tradition, that there is, well, not the tradition, but within the prophets, there have been instances where children perhaps have not followed the prophetic example. So it's not.
That's exactly. It's not an exact science. It's just you do your best, and it could be because they are not following your faith and they reject us, or they can be because they are having friends around and the environment is very important. You cannot secure everything, so you are not to be blamed if it's not a success. Now, what is important in the whole process when you deal with teenagers, and this is why some of the remarks that we had in the clip are very important, is it has to do with something that we are not talking about enough. It's this love that should be expressed, that whatever you do, I love you. Whatever you do. And we as Muslims, we think that the best way to protect the Islamic principles, if you are not going to respect the principles, I'm going to cut the relation. I don't talk to you. There is a lack of communication. That's the other way around. What we need to have is this love is essential, because this is the time you are constructing your personality. So you might be wrong, you might be rejecting, you might be rebellious, but at the same time, the message that you got is that you are loved. The second is what we heard also, it's about communication. And also something which is part of our tradition is that we are models. We are models for our. So this philosophy of models, which is part of education at Tarbiyah, is I'm going to get from you what you say, but I'm going to get from you what I see from you in your life. And this is something which is very important. So once again, it has to do with presence. It has to do with the non-verbal communication that we need to get in our life understanding, that this period of time, it's difficult, but there are lots of things that are happening, and love, communication, and presence are essential.
I want to press you on the point that you made, that I love you regardless of what you do. Because from, again, how would that square up with, for example, Prophet Noah's example, or Prophet Noah's example, that his son was out there drowning and he wasn't taken on. So do you love whatever the child does? Is that unconditional, that they can do whatever and get away with it?
Yeah, Noah loved his son, of course, and Allah told him, no, that's not the way. What he is doing is too much, so I'm not going to save you. But he was never told don't love him. That's not the point. The point is you might love him, but he's lost. As for us, no one is telling you your son or your daughter is lost. As long as there is life, there is hope. And as long as you are the father and the mother, they should be loved. That's essential. And then you try to help. You don't condemn your son and your daughter because of what they are doing. And the hadith is saying exactly the opposite, that you can do the worst in your life, and then in 1 second, everything could change. So we have to always trust the potential in our teenagers and try to go and to acknowledge the fact that it's difficult. It's difficult. I once wrote a poem to my son saying, you know what, I might be the way, and I surely am going to be the wall. That the way that you can follow and the wall. And this authority is also very important. Teenagers are not asking us, let me do whatever I want. Sometimes there is a presence, which is a presence of authority. That's not going to happen. I'm not going to yet to you do this. So we also have to take our responsibility to get this sense of, and this is why we have a problem in our schools today. Say, oh, you know what, the teenager or the student is the center, and everything should evolve around him or her. No. There are things that should be clear that if we are following a way, there are limits, and you have to be, as Luqman is talking and saying, there are limits. There are things that you cannot do, and there is something that you have to avoid, arrogance, and you have to be humble, and you need to get knowledge, and you need to be a dignified human being. But to be a dignified human being in our situation today in the West, it takes effort, patience, and once again, to listen. You know what is very important? Instead of thinking to the teenager I talk, it might be the opposite. From the teenager I get, and I try to understand how I have to adapt my education.
One of the other things mentioned in the clip was about the relationship that you have with the teenager son or daughter, and the relationship of being a friend as opposed to anything else. How do you square that? You know, because you talked about being the wall or the way. So in a sense, that balance. Where is that line?
That's very difficult. And if you ask the question, it's because, as me, we know that it's difficult to be a friend and to be sometimes in some situation, yes, a friend that I'm ready to listen. I can listen to everything that you have to say, and sometimes that you have to say no. There are limits in what. So it's a chemistry between the authority that should be there, so the wall, and the friendship that should be there. So this is the communication, and we need to have both. At one point, you should be able to say to your daughter and to your son, "I'm not your friend. I'm not. I'm your father, or I'm your mother." In fact, you know what? The chemistry is have enough authority and enough friendship to help your son and daughter when they are teenager not to have to pretend they are somebody else. So this is why it's very difficult. So your authority should not push them to pretend, and your friendship should not push them to do whatever they want with no limits.
Sometimes parents are seen as or are role models for their children, and so there is this idea of cloning, but they are being created for a time and a place that is different to where you are and how you are. How do you nurture that and avoid the cloning?
Yes,
or should you avoid the cloning?
We should not, and this is where Ali Karramallahu Wajha was saying that you are educating your son and your daughter for a time which is not yours. So you have also to get a deeper understanding. So this is why you should try to keep connected with the environment within which your children are living their life, their peers, their friends, the society, schools. So you need to be updated. You need to keep an eye on the environment, because the teenagers are not living in a void. And especially today, where, for example, you have the social networks. It's very powerful. They are. So we need to get a sense of the jihad they are going through as teenagers. It's not easy to be a good Muslim today when you are young. It's not. So instead of accusing them, let us be the people who are helping them to get the right priorities and the right struggles.
Lots of interesting points. It is perhaps unfair to blame the problem on the teenagers, as it is the adults who perhaps don't recognize that the children were not meant to be like them, as the children are created for a different time. Perhaps the issue is the need for the parent to adjust so that the teenagers have the space to develop their vision. The balance of protecting the child and allowing the child to take the necessary risks is difficult, and that process has to be navigated with the influence of prophetic wisdom. That's all the time we have today. I would like to thank Professor Tariq Ramadan for joining us, and I thank you all for watching. Until next time, goodbye.